In the borough of Doncaster, just on the border of Nottinghamshire, is a village called Jekyll. Nothing much goes on there in its dreary day-to-day existence, but a short while ago something happened there so shocking that the authorities even banned the press from revealing the full horror. I'll try to tell it as best I can. Taking the dog for a morning walk, Jeff's thoughts were all over the place. Balancing his job and seeing the kids, not to mention his mental health, were all taking its toll. And now, the disappearance of a well-known and respected villager made his head hurt. The Jekyll Gazette had reported missing Stephen Hawksworth, a semi-retired pharmacist, who was last seen leaving his house alone one evening. Most of the villagers knew Stephen by sight, if not by name, as they all dealt with him to get their prescriptions from the chemist. All of this was going round Jeff's head as he meandered through the leafy park when the dog suddenly stopped with its head in the bushes, sniffing and tugging at something. Feathers were strewn around, spanning a couple of metres, and with a little effort the dog pulled out the ripped-apart carcass of a large swan. Its head and wings were missing, but the poor thing looked like giant bites had been taken out of it. The struggle was obvious with the feathers everywhere, and Jeff pulled the dog away with the image of the dead swan etched into his mind, reminding him of just how fragile life is. That evening he called his friend Sam for the long chat they always had on a Thursday night. "It looked like someone had eaten it alive," Jeff said, explaining the incident. "Joking," said Sam. "It were only this weekend I saw a cat like that. I bet there's a stray dog out and about." "Yeah, maybe," Jeff answered. "Just makes me feel even more down than before." "You need to pick up your medication, mate. When depression hits, you need all the help you can get," said Sam with a little concern. "I don't know if that chemist's opened since that bloke went missing from it," said Jeff. "He only worked there part-time and all." The conversation lightened a little, and they had the usual banter before the call ended and Jeff retired for the night. As the weeks went on, more and more people were reporting the finding of dead and mutilated animals. Day after day, beloved pets went missing, and if their bodies were found, they had limbs missing and bite marks. All the attacks were centred in and around Jekyll, and naturally people were worried. A new development in the story was that the animals were getting larger. Horses and cattle were now being found ripped apart and mangled, with local farmers spending most of their time securing cattle sheds and building higher fencing to save their livelihoods. The village had never seen anything like this before. Then came the night that Sam disappeared. It was Jeff's turn to call Sam for their weekly chat, and on the dot at 8 o'clock he made the call, only for it to go to the answer service. He tried again with no answer, so he left a message and cracked a can of beer open. Strange, he thought. They'd religiously called each other on a Thursday for well over a year now, ever since Sam gave up work due to his diabetes. He drifted off for what seemed like a minute or so, when he was woken by a loud banging on the door. He'd slept through the night, and looking across at the clock he saw it was 9 a.m. He answered the door to see two plainclothes policemen, and after the usual introductions, he invited them inside. They asked him to sit down and then gave him brief details about a farmer finding Sam in the early hours near the small lake known as Mill Dam. He'd been murdered. They didn't go into detail apart from telling Jeff that it looked like Sam had been attacked by the same creature that was killing the animals. He was only identified by his tattoos. What they didn't tell him were the gruesome details of the attack. Sam's head, hands and feet were all missing. The huge bite marks in his battered body had ripped straight through his ribcage, exposing his innards, half of which had been eaten, while it seemed he was still alive. In the aftermath of the murder, the press descended on Jekyll like vultures, but as the investigation was ongoing, none of the gruesome details were revealed, only an appeal for witnesses. As the shockwave danced through the village, the residents responded by tightening security and installing wooden shutters or steel bars across their windows. Fear and anxiety became emotions they all lived with daily. This turned to anger when the news of a second murder was announced, but this time with an eyewitness. At around 9 p.m. on a Tuesday evening, a local dog walker called Janice heard a gurgling and crunching noise in a darkened, overgrown area at Mill Dam. The dog stopped dead, and the fur on its neck stood up, but intrigued, the walker went further to investigate. She wished she hadn't. Something was cowering over what looked like a large old sack, but as her eyes cleared, Janice realised with horror that the sack was a body. What was cowering over it darted, quick as a flash, away from the lake and straight over a wall, and made its way off into the night, far too quick to follow. Fearing to look any closer, she pulled out her phone, hands shaking, and called 999. Severely traumatised, she was advised to stay with a friend that evening, but from the statement she gave, it looked like, against all common sense or reason, that the police were looking for an animal as the perpetrator of these gruesome crimes. One common denominator in the murders was that they occurred in or around Mill Dam, and the police thought it worthwhile to place an undercover officer there for a week or two, with cover waiting nearby, just in case there was another sighting of the creature. The first week was uneventful, but the place had an eerie silence to it, only broken by the occasional ripple of water from the lake as the leaning trees dragged their branches in the water. On Wednesday evening, the officer in question was facing the lake at the north side at about 11 p.m. when he heard a rustle in the bushes by his side. He whispered into his radio that he'd like to take a look, but as the words left his lips, something lunged at him from the darkness. He felt a searing pain as the thing sunk its teeth into his shin, instantly breaking straight through the bone, rendering him unable to stand anymore. As he fell to the ground, the creature lunged again at his ribcage, ripping and tearing at his flesh. Its long, pale arms were only the thickness of bone, and its razor-sharp, nail-less fingers sunk into his eye sockets as it held him down and started to pull at his entrails. Police came out of nowhere and in a flurry of panic firing managed to shoot the thing dead. As they looked in horror, they finally saw the creature in full. Naked and flesh-coloured, it resembled a hideous, deformed skeleton tightly bound in skin. Its huge teeth seemed to form straight from its lips, and huge jet-black eyes peered out from way back in its skull. Although obviously dead, its body started immediately swelling. Its long arms filled out, its neck shrank and flattened. Its head shrank from football size to a more oval human shape. One officer gasped as he realised the monster was actually changing into a human now it was dead. The awful realisation dawned upon them as they all clearly saw it was the missing pharmacist, Stephen Hawksworth. "Oh my God," one of the officers whispered. The coroner arrived, and the two bodies were soon wrapped up and taken to the morgue for a post-mortem. The whole area was cleaned up and back to normal before the press arrived to what they assumed must have been a false lead. The next day, 4 officers were dispatched to search Stephen's house and ascertain exactly how or why he'd managed to transform into such a creature. Curiously, the door was found to be open, and there was no need to break and enter. The front door opened up to a corridor, decorated in bland creams and browns, and to the right opened up a staircase, which headed down into the living area. As they explored the kitchen, they found what looked like a classic science lab, with test tubes and containers filled with ominous liquids that bubbled and boiled. How cliched the officers must have thought it looked before they opened the door in the far corner to discover a room of horrors like they'd never seen before. To the right were severed swan's wings nailed to the walls above a cat's head. Blood drained down the walls in lines as various items of animal bodies hung in artistic arrangement and in various states of decomposition. To the left, they saw human body parts. Hands and fingers lined shelves along with feet and other unrecognisable body parts. The whole place smelled rotten, and meat flies swarmed around the single dim light bulb that hung in the centre of the room. Straight in front of the officers was the central altar, which resembled a shrine. A human head sat right in the centre. It was Sam, the first one to disappear. One of the officers threw up in an involuntary display of repulsion as they all made a hasty exit in single file back up the stairs. A month passed, and after a thorough investigation, it seemed that Stephen Hawksworth, as a pharmacist, had been experimenting with various chemicals in an attempt to cure a number of illnesses, along with boosting human strength. He'd used himself to experiment on, and in doing so, managed to alter his DNA to such an extent that his physical and mental form degraded massively, and he literally became a monster. The alternating effect of these chemicals meant he morphed in and out of these states, and in his moments of cohesiveness managed to have the foresight to lock himself away. While he was the monster, however, he would roam the village at night, graduating from animals to humans in his bloodlust. The police reports were written up, and the case, much to everyone's relief, was closed. Months passed, and Jeff, although still suffering from depression, was at least feeling a little better now he'd been taking his medication. He strolled with the dog through the familiar setting of the park, now in the full bloom of spring. As his mind wandered, the dog stopped dead. Jeff tugged on the animal before looking round to see the carcass of a dead swan. Its head was missing, along with its wings, and what appeared to be bite marks covered its battered body.